of freedom land.
Sitting down to stand up, a saying that does not seem to make any sense, turns out to be a paradox that essentially sums up the whole overall motive of a major turning point in the very much well-known civil rights movement in the United States. This was none other than the sit-in movement of 1960. The sit-in movement began in February of 1960, sparked by the Greensboro sit-in, where 4 African-American students, including Ezell Blair, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, sat at Woolworth's white-only lunch counter in Greensboro. The 4 entered the store, purchased small items, and sat at the lunch counter, which was designated for only white patrons. Black customers, on the other hand, were only allowed at a standing snack bar. Refusing to leave when denied service, they demonstrated unwavering determination. Their actions sparked a wave of sit-ins across the South organized by groups like the SNCC. The movement gained widespread attention, applying pressure that ultimately led to the abolition of discriminatory legislation. So, the question is, how was the sit-in movement so successful? Well, the answer is, the sit-in movement achieved significant success and societal impact due to its effective attraction of public attention, its accessibility when it comes to participation, the rise of youth leadership, and the economic pressure it exerted on segregated dining establishments. Number 1. Public attention. The reason why the Greensboro sit-in stood out from other protests and sparked a movement was due to the public support gained. Firstly, the surge in public attention was most evident in the rapid escalation of protests. The morning after the initial incident that sparked the movement, the Greensboro 4 returned with 16 friends. Once again, they were denied service but remained at the restaurant until closing, just as they had the day before. The following day, the students returned, this time filling nearly all 40 seats at the Woolworth's counter. By the end of the week, approximately 200 students had joined the Greensboro sit-ins, marking a significant escalation in the protest. The rapid growth of the movement was very evident through the exponential progression of the number of participants and the speed at which the movement expanded over such a short time frame of a single week, showing the steadfast growing momentum of the movement that would eventually contribute so much to its success. An act of rebellion would not be able to turn into a successful revolution without the involvement of a large public population. By the end of that month, students had led sit-in demonstrations in 30 cities across 7 states. A month later, the movement had expanded to include protests in 48 cities spanning 11 states. By the close of that spring, sit-ins had taken place in all 13 southern states, involving roughly 50,000 participants. This far reach emphasizes on the utmost disillusionment and indignance of the general population, along with their determination to stand up for their rights. As more people joined, the movement became more visible, encouraging others to step forward and speak up, even if they hadn't before. Large gatherings and broader participation helped raise awareness, serving as a wake-up call for both white and black communities and creating a positive feedback loop that consistently continues to build upon the growth of the sit-ins. This further reveals the significant role of public participation in the success of the sit-in movement. Secondly, the success of the sit-in movement in terms of public engagement would not have been possible without the crucial support of the media. On the day of the Greensboro sit-in, because of the 4 men refusing to stand up and leave the seats of the store, the manager called the police for assistance. At the same time, Rolf Johns, a local white businessman that the Greensboro 4 enlisted for help, had alerted the local media. The police arrived, only to announce that there was nothing to be done due to the lack of provocation. The media response, however, was immediate. A photo of the Greensboro 4 appeared in the local newspapers, and the protest quickly expanded. The participation of the local media made sure that the demonstration received widespread attention, even if the police were powerless to stop the Greensboro 4. In addition to documenting their nonviolent opposition, the newspapers' images of the protesters encouraged others to join the cause, which accelerated its growth. This illustrates how media attention played a crucial role in energizing the public and raising awareness of the cause, turning a small-scale event into a revolution. The media coverage of the protests brought the demonstrators' plight directly to the living rooms of families across the country. As the late senior John Lewis remarked, "Seeing people sitting in the Carolinas every night gave us a sense of kinship, a bond. We said, if they can do it in Montgomery and Greensboro, we can do it in some of these smaller cities." Effectively emphasizes on how crucial media coverage was in enhancing the sit-in movement's impact. The media raised awareness of the protesters' predicament and fostered empathy and sympathy throughout the nation by airing the demonstrations to a nationwide audience. Senior John Lewis's reflection highlights how witnessing these brave deeds on TV encouraged others to join the cause, creating a sense of cohesion and momentum that allowed the demonstrations to spread to smaller cities. This illustrates how the sit-in campaign might not have attained the same degree of national influence and public participation in the absence of media attention. The second main reason for the sit-in movement's success and rapid momentum was the accessibility, coupled with the profound effectiveness of its protest sites and methods. Firstly, the chosen public spaces or protest sites were accessible and inclusive, making them ideal locations that also increased the effectiveness of the demonstrations. The student protesters were driven to target department store lunch counters, not by a calculated analysis of how lawyers might respond to their demand for equal access, nor by aspirations for a Supreme Court victory. Instead, it was their personal and direct experience of exclusion that compelled them to act. Because the student protesters' goals were not to involve the court or any process of litigation, the lunch counters very reasonably became the target locations for these sit-ins. Bodies that work with mostly the legal aspects of civil rights seem to not view segregated lunch counters or public accommodation as susceptible targets for change, focusing more on the abstract and perplexed processes of litigation. On the other hand, the students took a more practical approach, making desegregation direct, effective, and inclusive. Lunch counters, being very widespread, provided a relatable and accessible platform for protests, as nearly every African American had experienced such discrimination. Not only did the abundance of lunch counters make the protests very accessible to all, it also increased the relatability of the problem raised. Furthermore, at the time of the sit-ins, in the whole United States of America, there were approximately more than 30,000 lunch counters present in drug and department stores, bus terminals, and public buildings. Many of them were part of large national chains such as Woolworth, McCrory, and Crest. This abundance of stores made lunch counters one of the most commonly segregated public accommodations back in the days. Ubiquitous in most department stores, they were extremely easy to find, thus providing numerous platforms where protesters were able to organize their sit-in demonstrations. This, of course, contributed greatly to the public participation of the movement, the ultimate factor that led to the impactful success of the sit-ins, letting people nationwide contribute their support with actual actions. The lunch counters were everywhere, thus being very accessible in the sense that anybody could be there, just not in the way that they would be served if they were not a person of color. Secondly, the chosen method of protest significantly enhanced the movement's public accessibility and was a key factor in the overwhelming success of the sit-ins. Some of the rules set off by movement leaders were as follows: don't strike back or curse aloud if abused, and show yourself friendly and courteous at all times. The rules for the Nashville protest demonstrate the effectiveness of nonviolent protest by emphasizing discipline, respect, and composure under pressure. By instructing participants not to strike back or respond verbally to abuse, the protesters maintained the moral high ground, showing that they were committed to peaceful resistance rather than escalating tensions. Remaining courteous and respectful at all times not only disarmed potential aggression but also highlighted the stark contrast between the dignity of the protesters and the hostility of those upholding segregation. Thus, this disciplined approach attracted sympathy and support, helping to amplify the message of the movement and increasing its impact on the broader community, including business owners and the public, emphasizing on the impact of the chosen method of protest, which is the nonviolent method. The participants also made their stance very clear, declaring that the members of this group recommended that no bail be posted nor fines paid in order to 1. Solidify the Black community, 2. Mobilize public opinion, and 3. Weaken the opposition by showing that a threat of arrest cannot deter us. The students' willingness to endure arrest without resistance became a powerful symbol of moral resolve, demonstrating their commitment to the cause. By refusing bails or fines, they sent a clear message of defiance against the threat of legal consequences. The jail no bail strategy exemplified nonviolent protest, showing that even in the face of injustice, protesters would not surrender. Paying bail would imply compliance with the segregationist norms, but by rejecting this, the protesters showcased their moral integrity and determination, gaining public sympathy by exposing the injustice of their situation to the public too. Number 3. Youth leadership. The other main factor that fueled the momentum and the ultimate success of the sit-in movement was the active involvement of student activists. First, youth activism is driven more by a motivation combined of frustration and hope compared to that of the older generations. Azal Blair, one of the Greensboro Four, said, "Many of our adults have been complacent and fearful, and it is time for someone to wake up and change the situation, and we decided to start here." Azal Blair's statement critiques the complacency and fearfulness of adults, revealing a deep-seated dissatisfaction with the timidity of the older generations, suggesting that they are stuck in traditional ways of thinking and hesitant to challenge the system. This lack of resistance to an unjust social system frustrates young people who see the need for immediate change. His statement was able to represent the youth's determination to break away from outdated approaches and take on the fight themselves. Thus, their activism is not only fueled by their own intrinsic indignance towards the social structure, but also a frustration with the older generation's reluctance. Thus, this makes the student a lot more willing to fight and take action, showing how their participation likely sped up the momentum of the movement. Furthermore, according to the students, during the demonstration, a Black woman kitchen helper walked up and told them, "You know you're not supposed to be in here." She later called them ignorant and a disgrace to their race. Given that the woman was also Black, she would be expected to probably sympathize with the student demonstrators and still support them silently if she did not want to participate. The woman's criticism of the student, calling them ignorant and a disgrace to their race, reflects an internalized acceptance of segregation and fear of challenging societal norms. Although she was a part of the oppressed population of the country, her way of old-fashioned thinking still agrees with the system, exemplifying the reluctance of some older individuals to fight against injustice, viewing activism as disruptive rather than necessary. For the youth, this resistance from their own community added to their frustration and reinforced their resolve to push for change. Their defiance of these outdated attitudes show how their activism was fueled by a desire to break free from such complacency and create a more just society. Secondly, motivated by a much more practical sense of frustration and hope rather than one driven by legal action, the students were more effective at putting their goals into action. Students at the Shaw University and St. Augustine's College viewed their participation in sit-ins and other protests as part of their education. They believed that their level of education was not commensurate with their opportunities, which had been limited in a segregated society. The evidence supports the idea that the students' activism was deeply rooted in the sense of practical motivation by linking their education to their desire for equality. Viewing their protests as an extension of their learning highlights how the students saw activism as a predetermined way to address the gap between their potential and the limited opportunities afforded to them in a segregated society. This frustration with the systemic inequality, combined with hope that their actions would pave way for greater opportunities, drove them to integrate their activism into personal and educational growth, making their efforts both purposeful and impactful. Last but not least, another factor that greatly contributed to the triumph of the sit-in movement was the economic impact that the demonstrations were able to exert upon these segregated restaurants and eateries. First, the sit-in movement caused a noticeable decline in sales for segregated restaurants as many Black protesters now overwhelmed shops and occupied seats, not allowing for regular business flow. As the student demonstrators continued with the sit-ins to try and dismantle the Jim Crow system, Nashville businessmen were secretly meeting to discuss their difficult situation. Time magazine described most store owners as pocketbook integrationists, prioritizing their bottom line over the city's segregationist norms. While Nashville's merchants acknowledged that desegregation was inevitable, they were reluctant to take the first step to drive social change. However, the economic disruption caused by the boycott forced them to act. Under the pressure, 6 stores, led by Kane, Sloan, and Harvey's, began serving Black customers on May 10, 1960. The description of Nashville store owners as pocketbook integrationists highlights their prioritization of profits over maintaining segregation. Thus, faced with financial strain, the situation makes it even easier for them to lean towards desegregation when they were forced to confront it. Though reluctant, desegregation was inevitable, as the economic instability was too great of a pressure for store owners to withstand the proscriptive laws that had been implemented for way too long. This demonstrates how the sit-ins directly implanted the financial viability of segregated businesses, pushing them towards social change. The targeted economic withdrawal amplified with the movement's impact might have been the most direct cause for the change in people's mindsets, making desegregation not just a moral imperative but also an economic necessity for department stores to stay in business. In conclusion, due to its ability to effectively garner public attention, its accessibility for participation, the emergence of student leadership, and the financial pressure it placed on segregated dining facilities, the 1960s sit-in movement saw tremendous success and a huge impact on society. The sit-in movement not only challenged the status quo of racial segregation, but also ignited a wave of activism that inspired future generations to stand up for justice and equality, leaving an enduring legacy in the fight for civil rights. The courage and determination of those who participated in the sit-ins highlighted the power of peaceful resistance and grassroots organizing. Their efforts were able to reshape public opinion, influence policy changes, and set the stage for subsequent milestones in the civil rights movement. The sit-in movement stands as a powerful reminder that ordinary people, through collective action, can also bring about extraordinary change.